Welcome to another episode of Energy Bites. I'm Bobby Neal, and I've got the rad dad, John Kyle Fan, over here with me. How's it going?
How's it going, Bobs?
And excited, we got David Yaffe with us from Estuary.dev, his founder and CEO, and really excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So, Ian, like I said, usually we kick this off with maybe a current event or something we saw in the news or on LinkedIn. And I think last night I saw a few people posting about how their Fivetran bills have with renewals and everything are starting to go up 50, 30% year over year, and people aren't too pleased about it. So it's becoming a much more saturated kind of space, and just, I think it's obviously going to be pertinent to what we're talking about, but curious to get your guys' thoughts. Or I know, John, you said you just got a bill. So,
Yep. It's, even when you first told me about them and I started playing around and getting my stuff set up, it's like, this is really handy. But man, it feels expensive, even though, it's replacing an intern or, a part-time person for me. But yeah, they keep adding, it's like they keep finding new ways to add more data to the existing sources that they can ingest so that my bill is higher, because that's how they do it off of the MAR. And so, as with all things cloud, this is one of the fun risks of getting locked into a specific service, because everyone has the same general idea of a business model, or at least the PE firms do, which is, get user growth, hyper user growth really early, regardless of the cost. And then we'll screw everybody once we got to have them dependent on our stuff and raise prices when everyone is dropping prices, or, other things like that. So it's on my short list of things to do, is looking into some of the alternatives and competitors out there. So this is a really perfectly timed podcast.
That is, it's a funny first topic for me, and I'm very happy to be talking about it. But, something that I found is interesting is clouds always lower prices, right? Like GCP, AWS, one of the big things that they do is you're never going to have the cost of storage go up, right? It always goes down. And that's just like a fundamental thing. They rely on people storing more data naturally, not like making the unit costs go up. And that's a really interesting thing when you look at like vendors in this type of space that are actually increasing their unit cost as there's more competition. It doesn't make much sense to me. And funny enough, next week, we're going to be announcing a decrease in cost. So you'll probably have heard about that right up to this podcast coming out.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And it's one of those things, I can't totally crap on Fivetran. I picked them. And honestly, I picked them. I knew they were expensive when I picked them, but going through, for the point I was at and where I was at with the company, they were one of, if not the most prevalent in the market, and really, especially at the time, I think were the best at what they did. I kind of crowdsourced it, and I could not find anyone to tell me anything bad about Fivetran. And by all accounts, they've delivered on everything I needed from them as far as being reliable, having good customer service, and all those things. But again, when I went into it, I knew it was expensive. It was kind of that initial shock, like, wait, I'm going to pay, potentially twice as much for data ingestion as I'm paying for my warehouse. That time to delivery, where I could just turn on Fivetran and set up the connections, bing, bing, bang, data's all the way across, and that part's handled. Now I can focus on the business logic. But now with folks like yourself and Portable and some of these other folks around, it's becoming much more of a commodity, and people are doing it well. So it's going to be an interesting space to follow.
I think that's one of the risks, is that people don't do it well, right? Like you try something, you get burned on ingestion, and it turns out that's actually powering your production reporting, and you can't really make another mistake. So maybe that's one of the reasons that Fivetran's been able to raise their prices. There are some legitimate options out there that might not be great for certain types of replication. They've also bought one of the better systems out there. HBR is really good for very high scale replication. So there's some reasons there, I think, at least. But good options are definitely emerging. So.
Yeah. From my perspective, they were, I would say, the most established one. And honestly, out of the gate, they had the most connectors at the end of the day, right? Like, if I don't have to write a custom API or figure out how to write a custom API script in your system, if I could just click, add an API key, or authenticate directly and then pick which tables, like that's exactly the user experience. I feel like that they're selling, right, is, low code streamline integrations. And so that was ultimately one of the reasons I went with them, was because they had everything I needed. But as with all things, time changes things. And so I'm glad there's healthy competition in the space. And I'm very curious to kind of see what you guys are doing and hear a little bit more about, what you guys do and what kind of separates you and differentiates you guys.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a little bit of the background on myself. I was actually a mechanical engineer. So was thinking about going into a space like energy. I ended up at aviation for a little bit working at Boeing.
I was gonna say you were aerospace at one point, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. And I really liked it, but it just, for me, long term, it didn't feel like the right thing. So I ended up getting into tech and working at a couple of tech type firms. And so we built platforms.
That was pretty humble. As an ex-Googler, I think that's you worked at some pretty good companies. So that's awesome. I'm probably going to pick and prod at those along the way as well, because my biggest thing that I get frustrated with our industry in is it's like they look at problems like they're brand new and no one else faces them. And it's like, IoT, how are we going to deal with all these distributed assets and all this data coming in? And it's like, guys, this is not a unique thing. And maybe the bounding conditions that we have are unique, but the problem in and of itself is not a unique problem. And there are other industries and people that are probably either solved it or working on it as we speak. And we need to look outside of what we do on a daily basis to see what those things are doing, what's going on.
So the company that I worked for was, we were a business called Invite Media. We sold to Google back in 2010, became DoubleClick bid manager. I led product there. And so when I left, we had scaled to doing 16 million requests per second. So like, that's pretty intense scale to be able to actually listen to and hold an auction each time, looking at like hundreds of variables for each of those each second, and do that in an efficient way where you can make money. You're making like, hundredths of a cent on each of these options. So you can't really spend too much money doing it. So that type of tech, I'm sure it goes into an oil and gas type problem too, right? Like similar concepts, maybe not quite as high scale, but
I was gonna say, that's the thing. Like I guarantee you there's a dozen big data talks this year across the industry, but we don't, other than our seismic data, and I think Bobby and I kind of agree on this, seismic data is the only true like big data that we deal with in the energy space today. It's just it's so high frequency.
We worked at a company. We were collecting 600 hertz data.
Yeah,
at one point?
500-600.
From the field, but that was a very rare occurrence, and most of it was noise that you didn't even need. Like you could just kick it out. Like
everyone thinks they want 1 second data until you give it to them, and they're like, actually, I can't open this in my Excel sheet. So can you, filter it down or whatever? And it's like, so you don't actually want 1 second data. And
the pressure value didn't change, even a PSI over the last 12 hours, but it's okay.
Yeah, no, that's a whole nother can, right? Is a lot of these tests and science things that we do, you're measuring derivatives over very long periods of time that are changing very minutely. And so it's like, you're looking at trends, not individual points. So even then, anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But we really don't have like a true, compared to a Netflix or like a live ad platform like on Google, where you've got millions and millions of people hitting it every second.
Neither the velocity nor the volume. Like, I mean, because again, you're talking about velocity in the sense of, and you're also using it to make decisions in real time. I mean,
right.
It's not just collecting. Oil and gas, there's rare. I mean, I think we're getting to the point where there are applications like whether drilling or completions where people are trying to do autonomous drilling maybe in the next 5, 10, 15 years. But as far as really needing to process a ton of data that fast, I mean, we're not there yet. But again, I think bringing this all the way back, people have solved this problem, for different domains. It's a matter, I think, of identifying where those have been solved and where we can integrate those.
Yeah, I'm curious in that situation today, because now you're past all your, I don't know. At least I hope they have changed the architecture since you've been there, but I also don't hold my breath on that with any of the big cloud companies. But like today, I would think of something like a Kafka broker for something to do something like that, right? But I don't even think Kafka wasn't around back then.
It
Right?
didn't
So
exist, right? So that was a problem, right? We had to figure out, we had to build things with off-the-shelf technologies. And so we didn't have anything like that. We built systems for stuff like that without, like basically Kafka before Kafka type things like that. We're using messaging queues and doing stuff like that. However, the second company that I started afterwards was this one called Arbor. And we started that one back in 2014. So back then, Kafka was kind of starting to be a thing. And we chose not to use it and to build our own streaming system that was kind of like Kafka. That system was called Gazette. And the reason that my co-founder chose to do that was he thought that Kafka was operationally very challenging to run. And that he thought that
it was at that time. I mean,
I was going to say,
I
messed
around
was the
with Kafka
consensus
in 2017, 2018, and it's like you had to do the whole Zookeeper thing, and it was right at least when Confluent was starting to make it a little easier, but early on it wasn't there.
Yeah, if you want to pay Confluent now, it's easy. But even if you just want to go host it yourself, you better have an extra engineer at least to throw at it and make sure that it's like healthy. So it's not cheap, right, to run it. And we've been running this system called Gazette now for about 2014, 10 years. And so that's what our sharing company is based on. We sold that company back in 2016 to a public company called Databricks, and ended up saying, hey, this thing is, now it's a lot easier to run streaming. What if we didn't just try to go run this against Kafka and turn it into like another streaming system, but we up-leveled it to the point where it looked more like Fivetran, and you could create data flows that were truly real-time just with a UI. And so that's what we did.
All right, so let's unpack that, because that got me excited instead of batch instances. So tell me a little bit more, because we don't necessarily have the volume, but we do have a lot of situations. All the money or all the cost in energy operations is tied up in the operation itself, right? So time is truly money when you're delaying something in the field, whether you're drilling or fracking or flowing the well back, whatever it may be. And so having that real-time data is incredibly important, or especially moving forward for a lot of these folks who are trying to optimize their operations in as near real time as they can get, which we won't even go down the definition of what real time means, but near to the second. And so, at least my Fivetran setup, which I don't even know what tier I'm on anymore, is I think every 15 minutes it does its batches or whatever. But I'm very curious to hear from y'all's end. Y'all allow streaming or can do real time streaming replication.
Yeah, depending on your destination and how you're using it. Can you hear that background? So,
yeah, it's all good.
Okay. My dog has gone crazy. So depending on how you're using it, and we can stream in millisecond latency, right, end to end, because it is truly a streaming system. So you capture from a source, and of course this depends on what your source is, right? You can't do this with an API that only publishes data once an hour. But with a database, we can capture data in millisecond latency. We can package it up and even run transformations on it. So we do have our own transformations. That's another big difference between something on us versus Fivetran. And then push it into a destination, all end-to-end millisecond latency, so sub-second latency. So of course, that's kind of a bit complex, because there are two ways of pushing to some destinations. You can either stream data in, you stream every single event, or you can create a facts table and upsert the data into it. So we manage both options. When you do the latter one, you're beholden to the data warehouse that you're using, or the database you're using. Databases can still be millisecond latency. Data warehouses usually have seconds at least of latency at that point, but we're not talking about 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's a
no.
Yeah, that was pretty cool. So I think that also talking about the warehouse and stuff that you're loading into brings up another aspect of costs that people often forget. And I'd be curious, say from your side, whether it's, or say if we're going to focus on Snowflake. So, because again, there's a cost with ingesting too. You have to have a compute warehouse on to ingest data into your Snowflake warehouse. Is how efficient is that platform? Like say whether it's Fivetran, Estuary, whoever, how efficient is their code at inserting data into Snowflake? Using copy commands or Snowpark streaming or whatever. I think I've seen whether it's you all or a handful of other people have started leveraging, say, Snowpark streaming and can insert data much more cost efficiently and timely than some of the competitors. So curious, to hear your thoughts on that side of the equation too, that there's a secondary cost associated just with the warehouse you're ingesting into.
Yeah, I think, and that secondary cost, it's funny, over and over we hear that cost is more expensive than the actual queries that someone's running on their warehouse, which is super surprising. But being in this space for so long, you kind of realize how much effort there is in actually loading a warehouse in a way that's easy to query, right? So you kind of have a few different options for doing this. Snowpipe streaming is a really good option because it enables you to just stream data in. That doesn't wake up the warehouse. There's no real loading costs. It's very low, at least from a loading cost perspective. But you do incur a little bit additional loading costs on when you query the data, right? The problem with something like Snowpipe streaming is you get one row for every insert, update, and deletion event. So if you want to query that data, then there's a little bit of burden on the querier to either turn it into a facts table that can be queried easily the way you're expecting, or to structure your queries in a way that's a little bit more cost intensive. So there is a little bit of extra effort on that. We make that available as an option, of course. We also make it for people who just want to have their data structured in a way that they can directly query it. We make it available to just do upserts into the warehouse too. So both of those are pretty valid options. It really depends on the use case. If you care about sub-second, if you care about saving money, probably streaming ingestion is a great way to do it. If you just want it to be super easy, then a lot of our clients actually choose for us to just upsert. Even within that, like upserting level, there's a huge variation on how you can do it, right? How you can stage files, how you can copy them into it. And we hear that some implementations are really inefficient. So those can be extremely expensive to actually push data into the destination system. I won't name vendors because I try not to do that, but we've heard that from a couple of places.
Yeah, for sure. So you're talking there about like you're writing directly to a fact table. So is that a function of some of those transformations y'all do in flight as well? I mean, to have it structured into like a fact table instead of replicating it, stay exactly as it is at the source, or?
You can do that. When I say the fact table, I'm actually talking about replicating exactly like it is at the source.
Okay.
But we do offer the ability to like just, write a SQL query, take a subset of the data, keep it up to date as more of like a limited fact table too.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that kind of hits on what John was saying before about, we don't necessarily have to get into what does real time mean, but again, it means different things to different people. I mean, you talk to some accountants, and real time could be that I get this report every month, when I need it. Yeah, but then you got, I remember we had like he was an electrical engineer, but a guy who worked on like PLCs and stuff like that, and for him, real time was like microsecond or nanosecond, because that's how fast things happen, electrically. So it's you've really got to. Like, I think it comes down to that business side, then understanding the business and what the needs are to define timeliness or real time or any of that. So,
I worked at a company a while ago, which I will also not name. They struggled to get their sales compensation in order in the quarter that their salespeople were incentivized. So they weren't able to report from last quarter's sales enough to tell you how much you made for the previous quarter and set your next targets till like 3/4 of the way through the next quarter.
Oh, man.
And that was, like that's 1 month would have been real time for them for sure. It would have been an amazing achievement. But what we talk about is like millisecond latency. So like tens or hundreds of milliseconds. Really the biggest thing for us is wire time, right? Like when we operated as a cloud service. So data going over the wire usually adds 100 milliseconds to the latency no matter what.
What are y'all, what cloud are y'all? Are y'all multi-cloud? Are you dedicated to one or?
Good question. So we are just releasing our multi-cloud deployment, and that's going to be any cloud, even like small players. We're using a service called Pulumi. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but we really like it. And basically we're GCP, right? We started in GCP, but we can release a private data plane in AWS, Azure, Ultra, whatever you're looking at, and in the region that a customer sits on, so that it doesn't have to traverse, regions and all that stuff. And that was really important for our customers, just because they want to make sure that their data is not being like intermingled with everyone else's, and that we could potentially even deploy into their VPC.
Yeah. So, all right, and you said Pulumi.
Pulumi, yeah. That's it.
Refresh me on Pulumi. Like, is that the one? Was it like almost like a Terraform competitor, or?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay.
They just make it really easy for you to like create rules and recipes of like what I need to accomplish this task, and then they'll translate it across all clouds.
Okay. So now,
that sounds awesome.
All right. So you've got the multi-cloud coming out. So with that, is that something that, if I spun it up, whenever that's available, like, is it kind of like Snowflake where it pops up and like, where do you want to deploy this? And I choose Azure, Central, blah, blah, blah. Like, will it be like that? Or do they have to work with you all? And like, then you guys are able to set up an environment, in those clouds? Like, is it going to be pretty seamless to that degree? Or I'm just curious how an engagement looks with you all.
Yeah. So day one, when we first release it, you're going to talk to me. Yeah. And then I'll talk to my co-founder, and then he'll click some buttons on his computer, and I'll say, "Oh crap, this isn't working." And then, hopefully like 20 minutes later it will work. Yeah. But, hopefully, day 20 or day 50, it will be dropped down in the UI that you can just select from.
Sweet. All right. So, yeah. So let's talk about both sides of, Estuary sits in the middle, but like, let's talk about both sides. What are some of the most common sources and most common like destinations or sinks?
A lot of the sources are databases that we see.
Okay.
Those can be anything from Postgres to Oracle to SQL Server, the major ones. A lot of NoSQL databases too. We tend to see, especially after the Rockset acquisition, we see a lot of DynamoDB right now.
Yikes.
Yeah. It's actually good for us. So one of the features that we have is that we can take NoSQL documents, and we can look at all of an entire collection of NoSQL documents and figure out a schema for it, so that we can make it play nicely with like a Snowflake or a warehouse or something like that. So that tends to be pretty nice for actually using that NoSQL data, turning it into value, not having to eat JSON parsing and all that stuff. That's no fun in any language really. But then on the destination side, I was surprised. I was looking at it the other day, and of course warehouses are one of the biggest ones that we see, but a lot of databases. So when someone wants to do something truly real time, they tend to push data to a database. But the thing I'm most excited about right now for destinations is we are actually just releasing our Kafka compatibility layer. So you can get Kafka from us as well. So, instead of having to, so that means that we can now load any system that can talk to Kafka. So we're about to have a partnership announcement with a bunch of major real-time analytics companies like ClickHouse and StarTree and those types of companies that.
Nice.
Yeah. So they're a natural fit for our business as well.
That's very cool. What about, I guess one that, John and I messed around with, and then I guess, I don't know, we didn't end up using it. I guess like we had a bunch of iterations on this web development project we were working on, but have you guys messed around with like Postgres, like TimescaleDB, or feeding into that?
Yep. We have customers that use it. We have a TimescaleDB connector. It's a nice. Pretty cool one. Yeah, you can definitely use that now.
Yeah, because that really helps probably with the ingestion side. I know it's like it can insert a lot more data that way, and then it's also nice for querying downstream for people as opposed to just traditional OLTP or even data warehouse. So,
yeah, I've been surprised by how well Postgres even works for if you structure your queries right and you structure your tables right. Postgres works for real-time analytics. We currently power our own real-time reporting in our products using a Postgres database, actually.
Okay, nice.
And that, yeah, and like the key there is making sure that you're not putting tons and tons of very very wide data that has a high dimensionality and stuff like that. But as long as you're structuring it in a way that's going to scale with your customer base, it's totally fine.
Yeah, and that's something I forget why I was thinking about it even like today, but there's a guy in oil and gas that John and I are pretty good friends with, Jeff Hughes, and he's always banging the desk that all you need is SQL Server. Um, but yeah, I think sometimes where you don't really know what you want, like you said, you get this high dimensionality, and you get wider tables and bigger. Like those can be hard for OLTP, but like when you're writing your own application, or you've got a lot of control over the data that's going into it and the schemas. I mean, when you can write indexes because you're the SME and domain expert on that data that's going in there, I mean, yes, those can absolutely be very viable options for very large amounts of data even. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but I think sometimes where I guess with this whole ELT movement is like, I don't know what I want from my data. I know I can put it all in the Snowflake and store it there cheaply. And then if I ever need it, then it'll have the power to query out what I need. But when you're building more application, and I'm highly normalizing this data, and it's going to be mainly fairly skinny, and it can handle a lot of rows. I mean, I think it's very viable to do things in that way.
Yeah, that's funny. Every business that I've built historically, we've ended up having to scale data in some way, right? Like the last one, we used a Netezza box, and Netezza is, I think it was $1 million box that we had to buy just to run reporting for a while, and that data didn't even scale eventually. So it's nice to have this type of option for reporting, just pushing it to a cloud data warehouse and hoping that it scales for you and it works really well. But I think there's still an art to it and a science to it where you don't want to just shove everything there and then run production reporting off of it. If you're running the same query over and over and over, or a very similar one, you're probably wasting money if you're asking a cloud data warehouse to serve that as a reporting layer for you.
Yeah, 100%. It's funny.
Go ahead, John.
No, I was just going to say it's funny because that is literally our setup with Fivetran right now. Hey, this data is valuable. I don't want to lose it because it's coming from a lot of social channels that like to delete your data after or restrict access to your historic data and all the fun shit that people who shall not be named like to do, Google, but they Facebook also, or Meta, whatever the hell they're called now, but they so yeah, for me it's one of those things. Well, and like you don't even realize it, but you go in and you look at like Google Analytics is like the most overwhelming thing to try and understand from a data. Just if you don't have a data table or a database or anything in front of you, and it's just here's the AP, here's the documentation, and here's everything. There's so much in there, and so then it becomes, well, do I need all of this shit, or do I just choose a few of these tables? And then it's like you don't know what you need until you start querying it, and it's just this waterfall effect. So, but that you at some point, like for us, at some point we'll have someone who that's all they're going to be doing is all of our data and analytics and stuff. And so it's a weird kind of dichotomy because I know it's not optimized. I know it's not structured how it should be. I'm not even using the DBT transformations on them at the moment, but just knowing that it's going to be there, right? Like as an engineer, I'd rather have the data and not need it than not have it and need it, of course, which of course I'll be the first one to complain about other engineers wanting that, but it's a tricky problem. That's one of the things I was going to ask you, David, is do y'all also have connectors to like API sources like a Google Analytics or a Meta or any of those like third-party type tools outside of databases?
We do, yeah, we do, and we can connect using like a batch mode or a streaming mode. So a lot of those providers don't really offer streaming data.
Yeah.
There's a few that do, like Salesforce and HubSpot both have streaming endpoints where you can take data in real time. But a lot of them were having to, run connectors that are pulling big reports of data and aggregating it. We've kind of made the system so that it can handle both of those things. For your use cases, one interesting thing that I would think about is just storage tiers, right? Like, do you want that data all in Snowflake, or would you rather just have it in like S3 or Google Cloud Storage or Azure, Azure Blob Storage, whichever.
It's all
you're
going to
using.
BigQuery right now. So,
Yeah, and
but
I don't know how
yeah,
BigQuery charges for that, but I think it's pretty reasonable, probably.
it's pretty.
Yeah,
I'm also not. I'm not hitting it a bunch or really using it all that much, other than just for storage at this point. And yes, I had when I first started, I had HubSpot turned on, and then a few months into Fivetran, I was like, oh, okay, that's where 90% of my data each month comes from, and it's mostly junk, and I don't need it. So I'm just going to turn HubSpot off on that one altogether because we're not using it. But that's what I'm talking about, right? Like, HubSpot is effectively a CRM, but there is just so much data in there about, all the user activities and then all the integrations through GA and all this other stuff that you just start looking at the data. And you're like, what? I mean, I understand the app needs this data, but why is it even exposed to the consumer in most cases? Because I can't even envision a world where someone would need some of this stuff, but
There's some gems in there, though.
That's the thing, right? Like, as an engineer, I know it's better to capture more and not need it than not to capture the one stupid thing that I end up needing 2 months from now,
Yeah. No, it's incredible how much HubSpot actually has, all the integrations you can do. I feel like this space, just how all these SaaS systems at this point integrate with each other, requires like a college degree that no one has ever gotten.
Yeah. Well, that's why I think there's a huge market for what you guys are doing, right? Is it's like, hey, I understand APIs. I understand data tables and relationships between these tables, but there's so much shit in here that I don't need to. And the other big problem with most of them, which is why I'm all for services like yours, is that they always change. They're constantly changing their authentication stuff or their API or the new, there's new data tables that you have to set up a new API. Like, no, I don't want to mess with that on a daily basis. Like that turns, when you have enough of those, that compounds to where it's a full-time job, just maintaining and managing it, just the connections, not the actual data. Right. Like, and so that's why I think there's so much value in it, because now we finally have these SaaS software, we have APIs and, the Snowflake Parquet and all this stuff where people can finally start sharing this data across without having to be a data scientist to go, just handle it and manage it.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with you. I think, we were talking about the costs of ingestion. One of the hidden costs of ingestion is just that, like, APIs change all the time. There's no like one integration with any service. I don't care who you are. Right? HubSpot has 4 APIs, I think, that you can pull data from. Right? Like, it depends what you want. It depends how you use them. You can get whatever you want, but a lot of them are wrong for certain things. And you just really have to spend the time to get it right. But databases are the same way, right? When you're actually extracting data from a database, you can do it in one of 5 different ways from Oracle. And so they provide things like API layers that you can extract from, like LogMiner. But then you can also go all the way down and look at the underlying representation of the data within the database itself. And that's, no one publishes how that is there. And so when you talk about an integration to extract data from any of these things, there's not one size fits all, right? Like, it really depends on your use case, your scale, your latency requirements, and the technology you choose kind of has to depend on that. So, all of that together, I'm curious to get your thoughts on zero ETL.
It's great. No,
that's a thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, again, I think it's almost a paradox, because you're selling something that people are paying for, but it's like, that's not where the value is. But it's a very hard problem to solve. Like, the value is downstream of just moving the data from one spot to the next. Like, it's people transforming the data and reporting it and being able to make decisions on it. But oftentimes you have to move the data in some way, shape, or form out of all these different systems and into a centralized spot to analyze it. So I think anything that makes that easier and, again, within reason for a price, makes a lot of sense. I think that's probably where Snowflake probably got a ton of traction and is still getting traction. When people have a Snowflake data share, there's not many people still that can offer a zero ETL option like that just works, and that takes 3 clicks of a button. And I don't have to babysit pipelines anymore.
Yeah. Well,
or
even
wait for
Bobby and I have had that conversation about APIs, right? Like I'm originally as an engineer, I'm like, oh, these are like APIs are fantastic. I can pull all this data from all these places. And then it's like, well, shit. Now, when I've got a bunch of APIs, I've got to go read all the documentation. I've got to maintain any changes that they make to the documentation, if they make them to the documentation, which most of the time they don't. They just push the change, and then at some point the documentation gets updated. But it's just like a complete can where you're just, instead just give me access to how you have it structured and let me just copy it and then go do whatever I need to from there. And so just that, I remember when Bobby first told me about that, I was like, holy shit, that makes a lot of sense. And APIs are going to die because of this, because it is so much easier, right? Instead of me having even just like the act of it, right? It's not that big of a deal. I can pass, I do this all the time now. I pass a output example or API call response into ChatGPT with the API documentation and tell me to write the API call. But before, you have to go through and make sure you have every field, pull out the right names and all this stuff. And like, it just becomes, again, it's this compound effect where if it's just one, not that big of a deal. But when you have dozens of them or hundreds of them, that is literally becoming a full-time job of someone that you're paying normally a decent amount of money that shouldn't be dealing with kind of menial bullshit like this, so to speak, that you can kind of code out of existence, or you guys kind of do, right? And so it's one of those things where I feel like, and Bobby is the manager, so he probably has a little bit easier of a time justifying things, but I'd be very curious to like, be a fly on the wall in some of those conversations with different operators and, just people that want to employ these services. And then just to hear all the responses from as to why they shouldn't spend money on this or whatever. And it's like the people who are making those decisions have never had to do it. So they have no clue how much it's just a true time suck at the end of the day, the maintenance and management of all of it.
A lot of what I see is that when people, usually the operators are choosing to use something like this if they're looped into the decision. And a lot of the times that something off the shelf isn't chosen to be used is by a big engineering team that just has a lot of resources and wants to solve every problem themselves. And that tends to be, really common. That, especially if you're at a huge enterprise company, right? Like a massive publicly traded company that has 1,000 engineers, and you can throw 1 or 2 engineers at solving your data integration problems and not really think about it because it's really not a huge problem for you. But I think it really depends on the business and also the sensitivity of your data and all those things.
Yeah.
The only reasons that I've seen are around sensitivity of data, or if someone just decided to go build something.
Yeah, right. Well, even then though, like if you build it, Bobby and I have this conversation all the time. There's a couple operators that are notorious for like bring in a new technology, have them explain how it works, and then they go and try and develop them themselves. But it's one of those things. It's like, as we were talking about before we got on, you go through this, the industry goes through these downturns, and it's like the guy that built that gets laid off. Then what do you do? Right? Like the tools like this, where there's SaaS, where you can move people in and out, and it requires very low level of technical kind of skill. If you need it to be that way, makes so much more sense. Is way more scalable and is probably cheaper in the long run. Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, I think it's back to that, like the value is not necessarily in that layer, but
right.
I'm probably going to pay a lot more for a data engineer who can build anything close to what Estuary does than I'm going to, but I can find a lot of people that can write some SQL and understand the business, and they're going to be a lot more affordable and probably wear a few different hats at a smaller company. But, the guy that can, write some, not even just Python, but, probably Go or Rust or, something more low level than that is going to be a lot more expensive resource. And they're not even the person adding the value that the business needs.
Right. Well, I just think too, like what a miserable job that's all you're doing is managing and updating APIs. Like that honestly sounds like a terrible job that I personally would hate. So having a software that does it for me, like, but tying this back, like that's why, in my opinion, that's what technology should do. It should automate the shit that humans are bad at and don't like doing. hard stop, right? Like, or make it easier, make it faster, whatever. And so like, that's where AI and these tools make so much sense.
Yeah, it sure would be nice if APIs were all documented and they were, what they fit well together, and it was easy for you to plug into a machine to understand how the API looks and just translate it and ingest it automatically, or plug in Gen AI to come up with like, the schema and all that stuff. But that is not the current state of the industry. Maybe you can get like a 60% solution using those types of things, but that last 40% is just as hard, no matter whether you're using Gen AI or off the shelf stuff or not.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're still in a place that it's not any easier due to all the recent technological advancements. They do that stuff, and it's just painful.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because on the AI side, or on the language model side, at least, right? That's a universal problem that whoever solves it first is going to make a shit ton of money, because everyone we talk to is like, hey, I want to be able to query all this numerical, database data in my language model. I'm like, well, it's not how they work. Like it's not just like a normal database. They're not made for numbers, all this fun stuff. But at the same time, then you've got the Gen AI side where it's like, I will probably not have to learn SQL because ChatGPT can write SQL very well for me, right? So it's like, it knows how to write the SQL query. Someone will eventually figure out how to connect the two, and that's going to be wild once that starts happening.
True. Have you ever gotten the SQL query that's like subtly wrong though, in a way that you'd actually have to have a master's in CS to figure out why it's wrong? That's the scariest part.
No,
right?
Absolutely.
Well, that, or you need to be the subject matter expert that knows that the data is wrong by looking at it, and it could be
right.
Something extremely nuanced that only the SME would understand. That's wrong in the results, or it's off by some significant digit.
Yeah, I always take them with a grain of salt, right? Like I never forget the time that I was asking it to write me an API call, and it gave me the script, but it didn't include a statement for the API key. And I'm like, hey, aren't you missing the API key? And it's like, oh yeah, you're right. And then it updates it and adds API. Like we're not fully automated there yet, but you still got to be smarter than your language model results.
Yeah,
for the time being.
Basics of what you're doing.
Yeah,
definitely.
So David, earlier you mentioned to John, like, all right, well, have you considered like writing it to S3 buckets or any of those object stores? Want to get your thoughts just on the state of the world around like with these open formats of like Parquet, Delta, Iceberg, and so on. And like, I mean, do we really see kind of a agnostic storage layer, being the predominant force going forward? Or do you think that it ends up boomerang back to, kind of what Snowflake or even traditional databases have been, where it's a more proprietary storage format? Because I feel like it almost sounds too good to be true that, oh yeah, all this interoperability, and I can query this layer with Fabric or DuckDB or Snowflake or Databricks. It doesn't really matter, because then at that point, does it really matter? All those engines are going to converge and be good enough.
Google will buy them, or Microsoft will buy it, and that's another thing, right?
Yeah, it was actually a leading question that I forgot to lead into, but the reason that I asked the question was because one of the big differences between us and any other ELT tool out there is that you can actually connect your own cloud storage as an intermediary and then store the data in your own cloud storage, and before you ship it off anywhere else. So you can have this copy of it, and that enables several things. Like one example is that you can push to multiple destinations since you have an intermediary layer, and you don't have to just do one-to-one. Another is that you can actually create transformations that are based on that as well. But so that's kind of our view on it. I think Iceberg is another really, really good view of that. So you can also just push it directly to Iceberg, and Iceberg can maintain a history of your data over time, which is, a really nice means of doing it. And we do have clients that are doing that right now. So Iceberg I would just say that Snowflake was probably our number one destination, and Iceberg is really starting to take over from that. As time goes on, people want to start even switching from, even if they're using Snowflake, they're starting to switch to first pushing data to Iceberg and then having Snowflake query that data. as opposed to directly, just so that they future-proof their data. They can ensure that, like, if they have another use case in the future, they can just seamlessly execute that use case. If Snowflake decides to raise their prices by, some egregious amount, or there's another better technology out of there, which is totally a possibility at some point, they're equipped to be able to do that. The other thing that it does is it lowers your ingestion costs, right? It actually has the capability to, since you're pushing data directly to cloud storage, you're not loading. You don't actually have to load a warehouse. You lose a lot of those ingestion costs.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, because I was reading the other day, because someone was asking, because I think Snowflake has the Fabric partnership now, and I think someone was asking about, actually one of our former podcast guests, JD Long, was asking around about it, like about the performance of Snowflake and kind of like almost like the responsibilities of each side of the partnership, and about being able to query one lake from Snowflake and how that all works. But I think I came across, kind of researching it myself then, was that at least Snowflake managed Iceberg they basically get equivalent performance to their native format, which is like, at that point, it's like, why wouldn't I store it externally? And even in like the next tier back of like an externally managed Iceberg, as long as it's managed, not just the Wild West, it seems like they get probably good enough performance. So it's like just having that, like again, to your point, you're not paying for the compute to load it, and then you're also getting similar, if not equal, query performance. It starts to seem like kind of a no-brainer.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And everyone wants to own their own data. This is the first step, right? Like, it feels like a really good first step to me.
Yeah. Now, what are you seeing as far as like, because obviously it's kind of bizarre, and I almost wonder if they did it just to spite Snowflake, but like Databricks purchasing Tabular, who was the maintainer. They were the maintainers of Iceberg, correct? Or they, is that how it worked, basically?
Yeah, they were the initial people who created it. And so had a $2 billion acquisition happened during the Snowflake summit, right? Like, all that stuff happened together. And I think it was because there was a bidding war, and Snowflake was bidding on it, and so was Databricks, and Databricks just came apparently 4x over the top or something like that. That's what the rumor goal says, just to get the thing done so they could announce it at Snowflake Summit. I think it's it's a huge waste of money for marketing, right? Like, in no world has spending $2 billion on 1 million in revenue ever been a beneficial thing. But it definitely shows that they're serious. Delta Lake has always, at least for the last year, been able to extract data from open source formats, right? Delta Lake supports open source formats. And so at some level, it's not doing too much except for saying, hey, everyone, we're really serious about Iceberg, and we really want to make sure that, you take us seriously when you're looking at that. And we are open source and stuff.
So then, in my opinion, it wasn't like Delta Lake is a competitor or a competitive format to Iceberg, or am I misunderstanding the gist?
Yeah. So Delta, I forget what it's called, but I believe they supported Iceberg before, and like a year ago they supported Iceberg. But Delta format is one format, and then that's something that they created. But there's an engine that has support for multiple data lake formats that Databricks supports already and has for like the last 3 years.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't know why I thought they were, because it's like basically either saying that Delta Lake's not as good as as Iceberg, or B, I think it was just, either that or they were worried about the viability of Iceberg and letting Snowflake own that and be able to drive that would be a threat to their business. But because ultimately I feel like Databricks and Snowflake are converging on the same platform, but from different directions. Snowflake started off as a data warehouse and is adding all the data engineering and their Spark version of Spark and data science, and then obviously those are the roots of Databricks, and then they've moved into the data warehousing side of the world. But I think because even what tabular is a catalog as well, right? Wasn't that a big deal with it? And that's what Databricks already had with the Unity catalog. So it was just an interesting, almost duplicate, technologies, to your point, like to go spend $2 billion on something that you kind of sort of already had.
Yeah, it's at least they're serious when they do something. That's an impressive. But they've been acquiring a lot, right? They've also acquired in the ingestion side of things. They bought a company called Archeon over a year ago. So that's another interesting one. They're saying that we're gonna make as much as just in native.
Was that the genesis of this recent announcement of, like, say, the SQL Server replication and stuff that they have natively? That's basically them weaving the Archeon stuff into Databricks.
Yeah, that's been a year coming, right? Like I'm surprised they didn't announce it a little earlier, but these things are hard. So
tech debt.
Yeah, integrating a company.
That sounds like the most miserable thing I could possibly imagine, is trying to integrate two completely different code bases.
I've done it 3 times. For 3 different acquisitions. Well, it's never fun.
I mean, that's why
I was gonna say Bobby's getting ready to do it.
Yeah, we're going through it, but I mean, that's kind of almost to John's part of your LinkedIn headline, the startup masochist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely the masochist category for sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I was manually tagging metadata to all of our sources this week, so it's a real thing. It's one of those where it's like you got to do it when you got to do it, but thinking about doing it if you don't have to do it sounds terrible.
All the power to you, though, because I know what that feels like, right? Like, turns out every problem's your problem when you start a startup.
Yeah, no,
for
100%.
good or for bad.
So, Dave, can you tell us more about the transformation layer in Estuary? And then,
is there that's what I was going to ask about.
That's even maybe open, where like people are able to source control any of that stuff at all? I don't know if it's a thing or not, or if it's just kind of native to the platform. And then just how do y'all play, say, even with a DBT or those types of tools, or what are you seeing in that space?
I'm going to get even more specific, Dave, since you've got the Google background. Why can y'all? This is one of the reasons I was looking at DBT, right? Or Fivetran plus DBT, was because one of the big data sources for us, being on the media podcast side, is GA, all the podcast platforms, all the social channels. But of course, all of them have completely different terminology for the same fucking thing, or new things that other ones don't have. And so this whole normalization layer, ETL layer, is important. But what I want to know is, like, is there a way, or maybe you guys have it, maybe somebody else does, but do you know of anybody that has a truly normalized, hey, here's all of the social media sources, and we're going to normalize those into one thing that you can use across all of them instead of having to do it yourself? Because I think that that would be a very good moneymaker if someone can figure that out, because it's a huge.
I've heard people talk about that, but I've never seen an actual product that emerged and just solves that problem. It's a great idea, right? Like, there's so many businesses that kind of sit on the edges of that you'd think would have done it already, right? I used to work for a company called LiveRamp, and LiveRamp, one of their core value adds is taking an offline ID and connecting it to an online ID, so you can connect profiles across the internet. Why not do that across social media platforms? So you can have a unified view of your data across social media platforms. Someone should be able to do something like that. And you're not even asking for something that complex. You're asking for just like mapping of names, right? Like it's a single file that someone could produce. So I'll keep an eye out and I'll let you know. But so far, nothing came up. To answer Bobby's question, we do a bunch of stuff in this space. We have our own transformations. We also work with your warehouse. And so we can do things like fire off DBT jobs using a DBT job trigger. We can do all that type of stuff. But that's not really novel. That's, just the same as what everyone else is doing. It's great for analytics. It's not great for like real-time streaming data. And a lot of our customers use our transformations when they care about like really low latency or in pipeline mapping data, so that they're joining two things, or they're mapping fields, or they're changing the name of something before it ever enters your data warehouse. So that's what people use us for. We have the capability to write SQL or TypeScript. I know TypeScript's a really weird choice. Don't ask me.
JavaScript. I mean,
But
there's plenty of people that know enough JavaScript to get by.
yeah, it's good for certain industries. It turns out that like a lot of people in crypto use that, which is random. We didn't know that one mean it. But we're gonna add Python too. In any case, the transformations that you can do in our system, think about them as a little bit more complex, a little bit less simple to set up, but super powerful, and they're literally millisecond latency. I can join 2 streams with millisecond latency and get a result out that's a fully joined up thing. It looks more like a materialized view. It's really good for filtering. It's good for aggregating, for summing, for doing stuff like that. And so if you have to invest a little bit more time, but it's powerful if you care about that low latency.
I want to make a statement that every frac company out there should be looking at these guys and normalizing their data before it gets into the stupid database instead of naming it, FR1. You can standardize your naming conventions, which will solve so many of your problems. And then you can also share the data across to other people or the operator or whatever, because it integrates. Like that's ultimately, so David, we were talking about the industry and kind of the energy tech stuff before, but one of the biggest issues we really have on the data side is that the oil and gas company, the operator, owns the data. They generate next to none of it. So the data is always generated by somebody else. So it's a service company, and they all have their own naming conventions, formats, structures, time, frequency, all this stuff. And then so all of them send it to Bobby essentially, and then Bobby has to just figure it out. Bobby, you can put rules and stuff around how it's structured and all that, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of normalization around it. And so tools like this, or even like the Snowflake Parquet stuff, right? Like that's really starting to take off in our industry just because there is so much data that is valuable when multiple people have access to it, but they still want to own the root of the data, right? Yeah. And so having these things is can streamline so much of this stuff and overcome a lot of these problems that I feel like most people have been making excuses for historically around why we don't share data and why we don't integrate data and all this stuff. Is like these tools exist, they're very useful, they're very functional, and we should be using them.
Are things like Snowflake data shares something that companies in your space would look at?
Yeah, I mean, and some people are, the more progressive people are. I mean, again, we had Brian Weaver on from Liberty Frac, and they're probably the most advanced, frac company out there, but as far as technology downstream of the actual fracs. But I mean, they have a Snowflake data share that they can offer to companies, but otherwise it's still shipping around CSVs and emails. And again, even from one stage to the next, the order of the columns could be different, or someone swapped a channel and this channel actually isn't that anymore. I mean, it's a mess.
Yep, CSV files. The way of the world still in 2024 and some.
Well, I mean, I'm glad if I get a CSV. It's usually like some bizarre formatted Excel or a PDF, but
or an ASCII. Yeah.
So I mean, like with that, I mean, and I know y'all talked maybe ahead of us getting started here, but when we talked before, David, did you say do y'all have like a handful of energy clients, or I mean, you may not be able to name one, or maybe you can, but just curious what some of the use cases look like that you're aware of.
Most of what we see is like database change data capture. So it's really like taking their data and getting into Snowflake for a company and energy. So that's really it so far that we're seeing. Sometimes a few transformations. Usually what we see with customers is that they start off doing the basic thing, and then they start realizing, we can actually add real-time transformations to this. This is interesting for a new use case that we have. And our relationship tends to expand based on that.
Nice.
One other thing that I've seen is that like companies have usually two sides of the business, right? One is an operational data side of the business, and the second is an analytics side. Yeah. We usually start on one or the other and then get roped into the other side. And that's kind of like my favorite way of running the relationship. If we can expand into the other side of the business, where like the first team that we bring in doesn't care about any of our core value adds. They bring us in because they're like, oh, we have some HubSpot data that we want in our Snowflake. And then later on, Someone on their team mentions in a meeting like, "Oh, we want real time, a real time view of this data and do something with it." And so they're like, "Oh, wait, I think that during the demo they showed me we could do that." So that's like my favorite.
That's awesome. Yeah, I mean, even for us, it's the biggest thing has been 80-90% of it is how do I get data out of SQL Server? Yeah, that's where pretty much every major software vendor in oil and gas uses SQL Server. So it's a good chance that all the things that most people care about come out of there. And then it's like, if you can connect to the Office suite, through like SharePoint and OneDrive, then you've captured another 90% of it. And then if you can go through and catch stuff off of a file share and SFTP, then you're about 100% of the way there. So
I was just going to throw out the FTP, Bobby. I'm glad you covered it. Don't forget it.
Awesome. Well, then I think we're pretty good in the oil and gas space.
Yeah. I think one last thing, and then we'll probably kick over into probably the kind of the speed round, or whatever. But what are your thoughts? I mean, I hear a lot about now the term's escaping me. Data virtualization. Have you seen that? Kind of in practice. I mean, obviously, it kind of skirts what you guys do, but what have been problems you've seen people have with that, and probably why they end up coming to you all and using.
Tell people what that is first, too. As
yeah.
Well.
So, I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
We I think a lot of people, if they're trying to do that, you kind of have to be able to combine data from a bunch of different sources in one, right? Like that's the principle of it. You're basically taking data from disparate sources, combining them into one, and being able to use that in a single place. It's almost like one big table, right? Am I getting that right?
The thing, I mean, I guess I've been a little, kind of hazy on it in general, just because like I feel like because say one of the reasons that say for us that I want all my data coming into a Snowflake or a separate data warehouse, even if it was a separate SQL server from all the different systems, is that I want that taking on the analytical burden and letting those transactional systems do what they do. And I think I'm just curious, like how like say the data virtualization works, where like say a Trino or something like that, where I mean, it's when you're doing that, like isn't essentially running queries against all the different systems and combining them in kind of a middle layer. So you're still putting that analytical burden back on those source systems, which is kind of the reason not to do it in the first place. But
that's exactly right. So yeah, like a Trino, that's exactly what they're doing. They're using usually like an ODBC driver to actually issue queries to their source systems, which is kind of like a big no-no in production systems. You don't really want to like hit production reporting Postgres database or SQL Server database and impact production and have someone be able to hit that query with who knows what. And lose a transaction while they're doing it or something like that. So I think that's one of the risks there, and you can do it in a way that's a little bit safer by having like read replicas and only hitting read replicas, or making sure that you're, but that doesn't really scale, right? The whole point of doing change data capture or offloading reads from a database is that way you can, throw a much bigger and purpose-built system for that at it and, not impact production at all. So, I think we see that there are some really good businesses that are built on that. Like I think Starburst is a good example of a business that they are the company that did a lot of this stuff with Trino. And they make it so it's easy to do data virtualization across a lot of different sources. But even in those businesses, like we have a partnership with Starburst, for instance, in which when their clients don't want to extract data or they don't want to pull data and issue queries directly to the source tables, they can extract it, put it into Starburst Galaxy, which is their cloud offering product, actually centralize it and be able to query it there too. So both methods are like kind of good for different options. And I think, it's not like you're going to just need one or the other. But I'm curious to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people talk about it because then I guess that almost goes to a zero ETL type thing in a way, right? I guess it's that virtualization layers that's doing the transformation and the providing the data out, and you don't really have to move the data around, so you kind of eliminate that data moving cost. But again, I think it's there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? Someone's got to pay the piper. And I mean, I guess one last thing, then like speak to how Estuary like handles querying, like how you all can hit production databases and do it with minimizing the impacts. Because I mean, I think some people think about like, well, I've still got to get, when I first want to seed my database, I've still got to load 1.5 billion rows out of this table into Snowflake. How do I get it out of there, and how can Estuary do that without crashing prod?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have a whole method to do this, right? Like this is something we spend a lot of time on. There's probably two things that you have to think about when you're extracting data from a database: ongoing writes and ongoing reads, and then also backfilling all of your historical data, right? So those are two separate concerns. There's a lot of tactics to do it. We've chosen to do it, and the backfills are incremental. So we figure out a way of querying the database in its natural order. The natural order is important, so you don't have to order anything. Ordering is an expensive operation. So we query the database in its natural order in incremental chunks, and then we're able to, at the same time, read the write-ahead log, or the redo log, or whatever the database supports, and be able to see like all the changes that are happening. And once we get to the exact place that we started reading the write-ahead log, that's a trick to do that. It's not easy. We stop reading the database, we stitch the two together, and we have our complete view. So that's exactly what we do for this problem. It's not simple, but like the keys there are incrementally doing it. So making sure you're not just trying to do a huge backfill query at the same time. Doing it in the natural order of the database so that you're not having to like impact the database when you're doing that backfill query. And then also being able to atomically stitch the write-ahead log together with your historical data.
Nice. Yeah, because even say with Fivetran, they do a pretty good job of it too. I'll, give credit where credit's due, but but I think they would even talk about like how they're much more friendly to databases than some of their competitors, say even at the time, where some of these competitors like, yeah, it technically does what you want it to do, but your sysadmin or the people, your accountants are going to hate you for a day and a half while it reads out of the ERP.
Yeah, and some of them, when we query NetSuite, when we do a backfill on NetSuite, there is no kind way to do that, right? Like you're going to have to cause some impact on NetSuite to do it, just because that's the way the system's designed. But in general, no one really cares because they just use it for querying anyways.
Yeah. Cool, John. You want to kick off the speed round?
Yeah, I've got one right off the bat because you're a Googler and you worked on the ad side. So what's your favorite kind of maybe well-known or unknown Google tool or GCP tool that people should be that you enjoyed using or liked or found value in? The answer can also be none.
I would probably say like internal Google tools that I thought were cool that we used that, like were interesting. So there was one called Trips that some Google person tried to create a business out of. I think they might have or might not have. I haven't tracked it, but that basically was just like this really great way of tracking your travel within Google and then accrediting you and also rewarding you for like choosing tickets that were not that expensive. So what they did was they looked at like the historical average for prices between those two destinations. If you're below it, they'd actually give that to you and you'd be able to use it towards your next ticket.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. And so it was a really neat way of doing it. It made travel like turn into a game where it would mostly force you into not taking business class, but then when you did, you felt really good about it.
It's like the unlimited vacation policy where it's like, oh, well, can I take vacation even though I have an unlimited vacation? How much vacation can I take? Yeah, that's cool that they like they gamified it. That's smart.
Yeah, it was really neat.
All right, so outside of Ben Rogajan, who's your favorite social media follow?
Good question. Wow, I would say so. Ethan Aaron worked at my last company.
Okay, nice.
Because of that, I have to say Ethan Aaron. He was on our team, and I've known him for a long time.
So you guys have some history, and now we're playing in the same space, kind of.
Yeah. We actually have a partnership too, where if you want a long tail SaaS connector, we're going to recommend them. If you want a database, they're probably going to recommend us.
Okay, nice. That's good. That's good to think of, because I mean, to give him credit where credit was due, I had a 30-minute call with him, and he asked about like 2 database connectors that I wanted that he didn't already have. And by the time I was done with the call, he had a prototype up that I could log in and try to do it. It was the most bizarre thing I've ever seen. Like, I mean, I don't know how they've got it structured in the back end, but I mean, he found like the API endpoints, or I sent him the documentation. He said, yeah, try this out. And like, they weren't perfect yet, but they freaking worked with it. And it was like, I didn't even get off the call and I had something in my hand. It was kind of bizarre.
Yeah. He's good with that. That's what they focus all of their energy on, right? So
yeah.
I think they have a whole system where, it can figure out the type of author you're using and all the other things, how to crawl the endpoints. Once you've done 100 of them, the next 100 isn't. And if you've done it intelligently, the next 100 isn't as hard.
So am I assuming that people find you at a low-key data happy hour in New York then? Or
they can, yeah. I'm actually about to have my first child in the next month, so you probably won't find me in a little bit. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thereafter.
Thank you. Congrats.
Appreciate it. I'm not going to sleep for a while, but we'll see.
Yeah.
You're acting like you've been sleeping. You've been at like 3 or 4 startups.
That's true. Right. I've learned not to sleep, so it's perfect.
Oh, that's the masochist part, right? Like, that's what I'm saying. I got my master's, and then we were like, hey, maybe we can start trying to have a kid. And of course, basically the first time, halfway through the master's, we have my daughter, which was supposed to be born after I was graduated. And so it's like, oh yeah, working at a growth company with a master's and a child. Why the hell not? It's, I think it's just inherent in people that like to build stuff, just like to be busy. What about either, I'll give you a little option here, either book or library, Python library, open source library. It doesn't have to be Python.
I definitely go with a book, probably, I think. I just was reading a lot of fiction recently. And so I read a book called, so I used to be into the golden age of Arctic exploration, if you're familiar with it. It's a period in the late 1800s and early 1900s in which like the British Empire and all of the empires tried to
map the world.
Explore the Northwest Passage, find the North Pole, and all that stuff. So there's a book called The Terror that is a fictional book about around the same time period that I just finished, and it was good. I would recommend it.
Nice. You got one more, Bobs?
Well, you're about to have a baby, so you probably won't go on one for a little while. But where's your favorite place to go on vacation?
Ooh,
or type of vacation, beach, mountains, whatever else.
I'm more in like the adventure style of vacation. My wife is probably more on the beach side, so we end up kind of splitting the baby a little bit, so to speak. But we tended to go to Telluride, Colorado, a good amount.
Nice.
Really love the place. It's just a beautiful place in the U.S. I love that area. We ski there. I go hiking. I just got back last week, actually.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I've heard great things.
Yeah, I would recommend it for sure.
Awesome. Well, that hour flew by. Dave, we appreciate you joining us. Where how do people find you, either personally or professionally?
Yeah, so our website is Estuary, ESTUARY.dev. You can find me at Dave at the same website. And, would love to hear from you. We have a Slack. We have, you can contact me at any medium, basically, and I will be there and I will respond.
Nice. Bobby, you know what next week is?
Calgary Energy Tech Night?
Nope.
What am I missing? Oh, the Hogs.
Kickoff, baby. College football starts next week.
They're still undefeated, John.
We're undefeated, baby. This is the season, Bobby. We're undefeated.
It's all good. Hofstra has been undefeated for the last 15 years now, so because we haven't played a game.
Hopefully we beat our Thursday night cupcake opener next week. But as of the time of this podcast dropping, the Hogs are undefeated and are on track to win the national title this year. So
I'm rooting with you.
Fun stuff. But again, thanks, David. We appreciate it. Guys, if you like what we're doing, what you heard, go follow David. Please leave us a like, give us a comment, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Also, jump on Collide. We're getting ready to debut the new language model here in a couple weeks. So make sure you jump on there. We also just had a couple AMAs and live streams that have been really good. So check those out. We appreciate you guys. We'll see y'all next time. Thanks.